Historians of Reddit, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? Now, for the first comment. We learned about this at school. In the 1950s in Borneo they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria. So, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars that the people's homes were made of. And thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which were eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't. And the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly. And that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem led to cats being airdropped into Borneo. Next comment. Pretty much the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR was already crumbling by this point, and so they agreed to allow the wall to be opened for a bit. Well, the guy in charge over in Berlin didn't really get the point across to the public very well. And as a result, everyone assumed that the wall was permanently coming down. This led to pretty much all of East Berlin flocking to the wall and demanding to be let through. The guards there knew there was no way to restrain all these people without a massacre occurring. And the Russian government had no real way of easily fixing the huge mistake. And so the Berlin Wall fell, all because of a misinterpretation. Next comment. The events that led and culminated in the War of the Bucket for sure. Essentially, one Italian state who followed Holy Roman Emperor stole a bucket from another Italian state who followed the Pope. War broke out. The Papal state highly outnumbered the HRE state, but HRE state won. Then stole another bucket. Was a trip for sure when I learned about this one. Next comment. In 1918, British MP Noel Pemberton Billing caused a major scandal when he accused actress Maud Allen and Margot Asquith, wife of the previous Prime Minister, of being at the center of a homosexual ring sabotaging the war effort. Evidence included Allen having performed in a play by Oscar Wilde, and Asquith having attended the performance. He presented his case in an article entitled "The Cult of the Clitoris," in which he claimed the exiled Prince of Albania had a black book listing all the blackmailed homosexuals in Britain. Maud Allen, who was in fact homosexual, Asquith was not sued for libel but lost. During the trial, one witness claimed to have seen the Albanian prince's black book, and claimed that the judge's name was in it. Next comment. Horses evolved in North America, spread during prehistorical times into Asia, and then later went extinct in North America. If things had been only slightly different, horses could have been native only to the Americas, or just completely extinct by prehistory. Not having horses would have made a huge difference to Asian and European history. No Mongol invasions. No European knights. Next comment. The immovable ladder. Guy leaves ladder leaning against wall of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem sometime before 1728. A thing called the status quo happens in 1757, which means don't touch shit on holy sites. Ladder is still there. Next comment. British officers in India in the 18th century were eating quinine powder to help treat malaria. Quinine is so bitter on its own, so they started putting it in their club soda to make easier to down. They invented tonic water, brought the water back to Europe, and they started putting it in their gin. Next comment. Probably how Pepsi briefly became the 6th largest military in the world. In 1959, President Eisenhower wanted to show the Soviet Union how great America was. So the government set up an American National Exhibition, and sent Vice President Nixon there. Well, Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev got in an argument over communism versus capitalism. As it got heated, the president of Pepsi stepped in and was like, "Bro, Khrushchev, chill out. Have a Pepsi. Quote, Khrushchev most have loved that shit. Because then the Soviet Union wanted to permanently bring Pepsi over to their country. The problem is that their money wasn't accepted throughout the world. Instead, like true Russians, the Soviet Union traded vodka for Pepsi. This was all good until the late 1980s when their contract was going to expire and vodka wouldn't cut it for payment. So instead they traded Pepsi, a fuck ton of submarines and warships, for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. Sadly, instead of terrorizing the seas and shooting harpoons at their enemies, Pepsi decided to sell the fleet to a Swedish scrap metal company. Next comment. Recent history, but it still boggles my mind. Jeri Ryan gets cast on Star Trek Voyager 7 of 9. Jeri Ryan divorces her husband, her ex-husband, Jack, with a really strong resume and a lot of money, announces a Senate campaign in the state of Illinois in 2004. His entry in the race is enough that it is now considered a toss-up. Because both Jeri and Jack are public figures, journalists push for their divorce records to be released, and a major factor in their spill was Jack's desire to have sex in public locations. Jack Ryan drops out and the GOP struggles to find a replacement. This leads to an overwhelming victory from the Democratic challenger, Barack Obama. The entire Obama presidency exists because some writers in the 90s wanted a big titty Borg girl in their show. Next comment. The British government wanted to get rid of the cobras in India. So they started offering money for dead cobras. To take advantage of this, many people started breeding cobras to kill for the money. So they stopped buying dead cobras on eBay. They realized it was going on. Next comment. Nixon created a chain of events that I find hard to believe. So in 1968, Lyndon Johnson is president. He's a Democrat, and the Democrats are having issues. The party is majorly split up between segregation issues, and they hate the Vietnam War that the country is stuck in. Nixon starts promising to end the draft, and he also proclaimed that he had a plan to end the war. Just before the election that year, on Halloween, a Thursday, LBJ gets on the news and declares that the war is almost over and peace is at hand. The North Vietnamese were participating in peace talks, and all war activity had been suspended. They left the peace talks because Nixon himself told them that if they kept the war going for one extra week, he would offer them a better deal once he was in power. So by Saturday, the North Vietnamese had walked out of the peace talks, and the war was back on. The election on the next Tuesday went to Nixon, but barely. The war continued for another 5 years, and in that time 15,000 Americans died, as well as who knows how many Vietnamese. LBJ knew about it at the time, because he had wiretapped the South Vietnamese ambassador as well as several others, and felt he could not reveal the extent of the wiretapping that Americans were guilty of, even if it meant Nixon got away with treason. Next comment. Arab Spring is recent history, but still history. Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor, has his wares confiscated. Unable to combat the police, he goes to the local governor to ask for his wares back, but is refused even a meeting. In response, Bouazizi sets himself on fire in public. It's not the sole reason, but certainly the catalyst for the Arab Spring, which includes civil war in many countries, leaders being ousted and, in cases like Gaddafi, executed. It sees the rise in ISIS, terrorist acts in the Western world, and other conflicts that remain active to this day, all because the police wouldn't give Bouazizi his weighing scales back. Next comment. I remember how King Henry I was returning to England. He allowed his only legitimate son, next in line for the crown, his half-brother and sister, and a bunch of really important people to ferry back with the guy who offered to sail the king back, while the king went back on his own. After they all get drunk, the boat crashes and only some random survived. This caused a civil war between England and Normandy for 18 years, 1135 to 1153. According to Wikia, chroniclers describe this as a period in which Christ and his saints were asleep. Next comment. The Miranda Supreme Court decision is one of the best. His case make it so that when you are arrested the police have to tell you your rights, and it became a staple of American TV. What most people do not know is that Ernesto Miranda, the defendant in the case, was a crappy guy, and about 20 years later he was playing poker illegally in a basement of a bar. He was cheating, and when the people he was playing with found out, they stabbed him with a knife, killing him. The first thing the police did when they arrested the guy that killed Ernesto Miranda was read him his Miranda rights. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed.